Welcome to a special edition of Not Reserving Judgment, where Christine and I are going to talk about the University of Toronto's motion for an injunction against the pro-Palestinian protesters who have been occupying part of the University of Toronto for 49 days now. So I actually was in the courtroom yesterday, so I got to see all of these protesters there and hear the arguments of the University of Toronto for why this injunction should be granted. This would be an interlocutory injunction, so it's relief that University of Toronto is asking for pending a full hearing on the merits, and it's a super interesting case. It involves all kinds of issues, including property rights, trespass, but also freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And so we're really excited to talk about it today. Just to give a little recap of what the courtroom is like, a lot of keffiyehs, as you can imagine. Most of the people there were supporters of the encampment, most of the people in the courtroom. And there were a lot of masks at the beginning of the day, although they did sort of take them off by the end of the day, and I didn't notice too many today. It was a little bit more chaotic than your average hearing, Christine. There were a lot of people sort of coming in and out in the middle of it and making noise. At one point, the judge chastised people for apparently there's some graffiti in the courtroom. I'm not sure what that refers to or who did it, and don't want to assume that it was anyone in that particular courtroom, but that doesn't happen every day. And yeah, these are really interesting arguments, so we'll get into them. But first, Christine, you actually visited the encampment, right? So why don't you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Yeah, I went last week. I went to University of Toronto. So I convocated in Convocation Hall. I walked across King's College Circle to do that. It was, big experience for me. And that's where this protest is taking place. So it was honestly kind of let down to see the protest because there's been a lot of, you know, hype about how big this protest is and how crazy it is. And I think I saw four protesters outside. You can't actually see inside the encampment because they've put these tarps around the fencing, so you can't actually see in. And then they have these marshals who are sitting at, like four different parts around the circle. But there was a lot of activity at Convocation Hall because students were convocating when I was there, but not a lot going on at the protest site itself. I didn't try to go in. I was just kind of wanted to see it. And there's a lot of images and banners and slogans on the outside of varying degrees of offensiveness or, that some which I found quite objectionable. Um, and some which seemed pretty just run-of-the-mill communist. But yeah, it was a bit of a letdown if I was expecting a
Interesting.
little more.
Well, we do know from the court record that there were at some points more than 150 tents, and if you look at some of the aerial photos that were in evidence, it did take up all of King's College Circle, so the entire green space that's sort of right at the epicenter of the University of Toronto, which is right at the center of the city of Toronto.
Yeah, and
So
as I said, I can't see in, so there could be like a lot more going on inside than outside, but there it was like very dead.
right, right. Okay, well, let's get into the hearing. There's lots to talk about. So I'm going to start and I'll go through what University of Toronto argued. So, first of all, it was Monique Gillison was the name of the lawyer for the University of Toronto, and the judge was called Justice Conan. I'll call him Justice K because that's easier to say. And basically, U of T started off by framing this as a property rights issue about whether U of T is the private property owner of the space, and if so, whether they can exclude people from protesting in that private space. And so, Jillison's saying that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so the constitutional document that protects your right to protest, your right to freedom of expression and assembly, which are both related to protest, that this doesn't actually apply to the university's decision to get to ask these protesters to leave. This is just basically a trespass case, right? So that was one of the big questions here, and we've been talking about this, Christine, for a while and writing about it and trying to figure out the answer because the law is not perfectly clear on that, right? So, like I said, this is an injunction motion, so it's asking for a temporary order pending the full hearing, which will probably happen, 6 months, a year, who knows, like far into the future. And U of T, it basically says they want to get rid of the encampment, but allow people to continue to protest between the hours of, I believe, 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. So they just want to get rid of the encampment. They want the judge to order that. And to get that order pending the full hearing, they have to show a serious issue to be tried. They have to show some sort of irreparable harm, and they have to show the balance of convenience favors them, which means that they'll be more inconvenienced if the order is not granted than the other side would be if it is granted. And so, first of all, something that's really important to know in this case is that in Ontario, universities are considered autonomous institutions and they're not considered part of government. So, really, whether the charter applies, that's going to come down to whether or not the university is implementing some sort of government program. Um, and one of the first things Jillison was trying to establish, because she wants to say this is like a trespass issue, is that U of T owns the land and it's private property. And to do this, she pointed to the University of Toronto Act, where it talks about the lands being granted, conveyed, bequeathed to the University of Toronto. Um, Jillison also, so she's trying to say this is a trespass case and not like a freedom of expression case. And she points out that U of T sent an email out to everybody right before the encampment was erected. And this was back on around May 2nd. And it said that U of T is not opposed to protests. So they knew this encampment was coming. We've seen them all around North America. They said, we're not opposed to protest as long as it's peaceful, but we won't tolerate the following things. So discriminatory language, structures, disruption, protest after 10 p.m., megaphones, disrupting safe entry exit, all of these things, they're saying none of this is allowed. Why are you laughing, Christine?
It's because this is literally every single thing that the encampment did. It was like they read this list of things they couldn't do. And if it had said like no gum either, they'd be like, oh, we got to get some gum.
Totally.
Like it was everything.
Totally. So, yeah, basically, this was just U of T trying to set up the idea that we're going to allow freedom of expression, but we're not going to allow encampments or occupations, which, of course, they did. And U of T put up this big fence, which the protesters obviously used later on to keep other people out when they so chose to. Not sure if U of T saw that coming or not. So, Jillison then moved on to talking about all of these signs. So there's posters that you've seen around the encampment. We've seen them on the news. We've seen them on Twitter. She spent a lot of time talking about the signs. They say things like this is the Intifada, colonizer free zone. A lot of them have the upside down red triangle, which is a symbol of Hamas's military wing. In the view of many people, it's used in Hamas videos.
It's used
Although,
specifically in their videos as an arrow pointing to a target of a person they're about to kill. So these are videos from first person body cam images on Hamas terrorists. And then they put a little red air upside down triangle pointing at the person you should be looking at because that's who they're about to take out in the video. So it really is a violent symbol, in my opinion.
Christine, as we'll learn from the other side, it's actually just a part of the Palestinian flag, and they've just
Yes, I saw that
turned
too.
it 90 degrees.
What a
Anyway,
coincidence
I
that
know,
it's also in the Hamas propaganda videos. What a
right.
convenient turn of events.
Right. So this is, Jillison is talking about the signs, and she has an affidavit from a professor named Cynthia Lazar about how she interprets those signs and slogans, and they get into this idea of intifada. And, one side says it just means struggle. The other side says actually refers to the period where, Hamas was blowing up Israeli in, nightclubs and at bus stops and on buses. And it really means something threatening. And the idea here, I think Jillison is trying to establish that this is a harm, this is an irreparable harm, because even though, if speech is free, if you believe in free speech, you should be uncomfortable sometimes. But Jillison is saying this is a harm. It's making community members feel very uncomfortable. And if the charter doesn't apply, then that's perfectly legitimate, right? So at this point, Justice Kay got into his first question where, he's saying, well, if this is a free speech issue, do we really care about how somebody objectively takes that speech? And then we get from Jillison the idea here is part of what she's saying is the irreparable harm is to U of T's reputation. And this actually was a really big theme, is that part of the irreparable harm they're showing and why they need this injunction now is that people are saying, look, the university is condoning this, they're allowing this, it doesn't go along with their own policies. And so, people are not going to donate, it's going to harm us financially. And to the protesters, that sounded pretty like hilarious, like, oh, U of T just cares about their reputation. But I think in terms of establishing real harm, like legally, that makes a lot of sense. So then Jillison, she's asked another question. So like basically, she's trying to say that freedom of speech is allowed on campus, whether the charter applies or not. Like U of T does care about speech, and the justice wanted to know, well, under U of T policies, would it be okay to, go around and hand out a pamphlet with that said globalize the Intifada or something like that? And it's kind of unclear. We got a pretty unclear answer about that. Then she moves on to saying that there's irreparable harm in the form of people being excluded, right? And so this also goes to the trespass, which is one of the irreparable harms that she's trying to establish. And she says that there's these marshals in place, which you mentioned, Christine. So they've got people guarding the outside of the fence, and certain hours, so before 11 a.m., only campers are allowed in.
I want to know
Um,
why 11 a.m. And
because they sleep
I
late.
really have to say it's probably because they're sleeping. Like these, I don't like want to just assume it's a bunch of layabouts, but I kind of think that it is.
I
I
think there's
already thought
some
that, and then I heard 11 a.m. and I'm like, come on, guys.
there's some late night partying. And
I,
anyway, so Jolson is saying, look, like if you okay, so they also have these guidelines that they've posted, and they include things like no hate speech. That's one of their rules according to the encampment, and no sexual assault, like obvious stuff like that. But they also have guidelines that say basically you accept these pro-Palestinian rules that include saying that Palestinians have a right to resist, and it's another term where people are divided on what it means. Does it mean like the most brutal terrorism we've ever seen on October 7th, or does it mean something different? And the idea here is they're saying if you don't accept this, you can't enter and use the space for what you want. And Jillison said, that the protesters have claimed that someone who identifies as a Zionist, for example, they might be allowed in, and that's because they do want to debate and things are open for discussion according to the protesters, which is a bit of a surprise to me, but I haven't been to the encampment, so who's to
I didn't
say?
try. I didn't, as a Zionist, I didn't try to go in.
See, I wouldn't have tried either. I would have just assumed
I
I'm
mean,
gonna
they
get into
had
some
red
confrontation.
triangles, and they had these red triangles and said globalize the Intifada. It's not exactly a welcoming environment.
No. Anyway, so at this point, Jillison says, like, but what if you just want to have breakfast on campus and you don't want to accept the right to resistance and like get into a little debate with these marshals at the gates? And this led to like giggles erupting throughout the courtroom because I guess they see this as a ridiculous proposition that someone should be allowed to eat breakfast, in this
Actually, they
particular
saw it
space.
offensive. They said it was an offensive proposition in their submissions today.
They say
They were
it's
deeply
offensive, but
offended.
so offended that they all thought it was funny. And then they talk about like Jilson's trying to establish the trespass, and if someone's angry or upset at the gate because they won't accept the rules, including, this rule that you're gonna basically accept their viewpoint of the world, they will link arms and shout slogans. And Jillison is saying this increases the risk of confrontations, which is yet another harm that the university is suffering. Jillison also quotes from Batty in Toronto, and this was a really important case, like precedent for this case. And what happened there was this was the Occupy Toronto protests back in, I want to say 2010, 2011, something like that. And these protesters occupied St. James Park in Toronto. And
But during the day, I don't know if you saw this, but in the evenings, they went and got hotel rooms.
oh, maybe
The
some of
tents
them.
were mostly empty.
I was there, I lived in that neighborhood and I was there lots. And at night, there were definitely some occupied tents, but they were, shall we say, um, substance addicted people taking advantage of free tents and you couldn't just pitch a tent anywhere then. So I think the homeless population was really into that protest. But I didn't know that some of them were going to hotels at night. Doesn't surprise me. Anyway, and so what happened in Batty was the charter there obviously applied because this was, public space, and the charter applies to government, this was like it's a no-brainer that the charter applies there. But there was a reasonable limit on the right to expression. And in this case, the expression that the judge bought was that this physical encampment is their expression, and the judge said, okay, fine, but this is a reasonable limit. And he said the charter does not permit the protesters to take over public space without asking, exclude the rest of the public from enjoying their traditional use of that space, and then contend that they are under no obligation to leave. By taking that position and occupying the park, the protesters are breaking the law. Such civil disobedience attracts consequences. In this case, the civic authority, which represents Toronto, seeks to enforce the law. And so, even if the charter is found to apply, you would assume that the Batty decision would be pretty controlling here, right? So that's why it comes up a lot for, especially for U of T, although, the other side does try and push back at that. Christine, do you remember what their counter argument is? I'm trying to think.
On Batty?
Oh, you know what? I think I know what it is, right? So the counter argument that the protesters at U of T say is we're only taking up some small portion of U of T, just this little circle, and there's lots of other green space that people can
Yeah,
use.
well, the occupied people are only taking up a small portion of Toronto.
Right. They're only taking up one entire park in the whole city, and this was actually addressed in Batty, where the judge said, okay, fine, it's just one park, but if we allow this, then every other park will soon have a
Yeah.
different protest encampment. And anyway, and then so Jillison goes through a bunch more examples of confrontations and people being excluded. One professor who's Jewish said that he was told, go back to your country, which is really offensive. And we don't know who said that. It might have been the respondents, it might have been somebody else. People yelled, Intifada revolution, all Zionists are racist, Jews should go back to Europe. Again, it's hearsay in a sense. We don't have those people necessarily, in court, and that's kind of a problem. But there's lots and lots of evidence on the record, direct and otherwise, that pretty nasty things, pretty racist things were said at the protest. So Jillison then gets into a bunch of policies. It's important to know there's like a freedom of speech policy. There's a statement on equity. And one part of the freedom of speech policy that she pointed out, which I think is important, is that, the University of Toronto says students do have freedom of speech, whether the charter applies or not, but where speech, quote, has the effect of interfering with speech of invited guests, the university can shut down that speech. And basically that's saying, like, if you're heckling someone else, that's not free speech. That's where the line is, and you're not allowed to do that, right? So I thought that was really an important point, and I'm going to try and move a little bit quicker through this because there's a lot to say. But one interesting point is this particular judge recently decided another case, the animal justice
Mhm.
case, which Christine spoke about on the podcast, and that was interesting because it found the charter applied to private property in this particular case, where the government, the Ontario
There was
government, was
legislation. There was
right.
legislation that applied. There's not legislation here that's an issue.
Well, not really, although the protesters do suggest, and we'll get into that, that there is some legislation in the form of a directive, but
Yeah, the U of T, or sorry, the free speech directive from the Ford government.
yeah, so we'll talk about that later, I think. But animal justice, so basically in that case, Jillison pulled a quote and she said, the purpose, this is quoting the judge back to himself, and he said, the purpose of protecting freedom of expression is to do just that, allowing people to express themselves. It does not allow people to appropriate, even momentarily, the property of others as a means for that expression. And the justice pushed back a little bit, and he was talking about, this is a different form of property. I'm not sure if he was talking about the animals or the farms themselves that this other case applied to, but seemed to backfire a little bit on on the lawyer in that particular case. I'm just going to move through some of my notes here. Okay, and then they get back into, okay, well, U of T says some protests are allowed, but this protester is not. Where is the line? And Jillison says that the die-in protest. So people held a protest called a die-in protest right outside convocation, during convocation, and as long as that was not like making so much noise that people couldn't participate in convocation inside, that would be acceptable at U of T, but this encampment is not. Um, then we get into the trespass stuff. So Jillison walks through a number of trespass cases, one called CN Rail, where an injunction was granted to stop a blockade of rail lines, another one called Windsor Salt, where blocking the entry and exit of, I guess, some sort of salt facility, I don't know, was unlawful. And the judge said that it's unlawful because there's, nuisance trespass or intimidation. And that's a really important case here because the argument is that when you have trespass, that's a tort, that's illegal, and that's not a form of expression that the charter is meant to protect. It didn't mean to protect expression that is in other ways illegal. And that also goes to this idea that the irreparable harm is the trespass itself. So, once you've taken someone else's property and you're trespassing on it, that is harm, and that's harm that the court needs to stop. She gets into some other harms that are fairly minor, like traffic was briefly blocked. There was graffiti, which was apparently with sidewalk chalk. Doesn't seem all that serious.
I think the things that it said was really bad. I think that
Oh,
it was saying things that were extremely anti-Semitic from what I recall.
yeah, and some of it was the inverted red triangle thing too, right? So I guess it's harm to the community in the
I think
sense of
it's less about the graffiti being, not permanent and more about what the graffiti said.
right, right. What else? So just trying to like list off all these harms that because some of them are kind of iffy. One is broadcasting of a distressing image, which I think was a Hamas flag,
It was the
and
Hamas brigade, the
right.
whatever they're called, the military brigade of Hamas.
And there's a bunch of debate about whether it was a broadcast from Al Jazeera. It sounds like it,
Yeah.
it would be. And then she gets back into the alumni harm and the harm to U of T's reputation. And a big question here is, U of T asserts their reputation is being harmed in all kinds of ways. And the protesters say, yes, it's being harmed, but it'll be harmed more if you end our encampment because all kinds of alumni are on our side. And there wasn't, honestly, there was not that much evidence of harm to the reputation, in the sense of like, I think there was only one donor who pulled their scholarship on the record. And so I don't know how much evidence there was. Then we get back into, and this was, it was sort of jumping all over the place with the different harms, but we hear about more sort of hearsay comments from emails to U of T. These include people saying they were told go back to Poland. They were told death to an ethnic group, Jews in the sea. People say there were punches, but this is all, sort of hearsay. We don't really know for sure. A woman said she was accosted for wearing a Star of David. Doesn't really surprise me at all if that was true. And then another irreparable harm is supposedly the health and safety risks. And to me, these don't seem all that convincing. Like there was the human waste issue, which U of T quickly sort of dealt with through providing porta potties and unlocking a library for people to use overnight. Toronto Fire ordered them to create safety exits, and they did. And then there's some debate over whether they were properly open and whether emergency rooms were blocked. And then we get into sort of the balance of convenience. So like who's being more harmed
Mhm.
if the injunction is granted versus not granted. And Jillison says, she reiterates the reputation thing. She says it's getting worse and worse, and U of T is being sort of attacked on all sides for not ending the encampment and getting rid of the sort of hateful speech and all of that. And she put up a statement from Toronto Police that said to the University of Toronto, basically, we're not going to enforce your property rights unless there's a public safety risk or a court order. And so that's why Jillison says they need the court order. Specifically, they want an order against interference with access to university property, an order against interfering with the removal of the tents and the structures and the barriers, no gathering from 11 p.m. to 7, and they want some time to rehabilitate the grass. And then we get onto the charter stuff. So this was a much shorter part of the argument, and it was delivered by a lawyer named Megan Bridges. I thought she was very good for what it's worth. She says the court doesn't need to decide the charter issue because the injunction can be granted based on the fact that this is, private property and the trespass issue. And she goes through section 32 of the charter, which is where the charter talks about the fact that it only applies to Parliament, the government of Canada, the legislature, the governments of the provinces, and there is one wrinkle in this, which is sort of what the entire respondents, protesters argument hinges on, and that's the idea from this case called Eldridge that the charter can apply to non-government in respect of particular activities if they can be ascribed to government. So if you're basically fully doing the government's bidding, is how I like to think of it.
Like a professional regulator.
That's one example for sure. What's the other big example? Oh, the other one's Eldridge. So there's a case from BC, and this was sort of where this was hashed out. Well, first of all, in the law, there was a case called McKinney and Guelph, where Guelph had a mandatory retirement policy. So did U of T and all these universities, and it was challenged, and the court said Guelph is independent and it's not government, and the charter doesn't apply. And then this Eldridge case in BC, it was, I believe it was deaf people. Do you remember,
I
Christine?
don't remember.
I think it was people who were deaf. Yeah, they wanted interpretation services, and they said a hospital is discriminating by not providing these services to disabled people, people with hearing impairment. And the hospital said, too bad, we're not government, because, hospitals aren't government. They're actually just nonprofits, like charities. People assume they're government, but they're not. But in this case, the hospital was fully implementing a government program. It was, everything the hospital was doing was being paid for by government and directed by government. And the
And you can't
statute,
get an alternative. There's no way to go outside the government
no,
system.
there sure is not, although there obviously should be.
Yeah.
Something we were discussing earlier today on Every Day. So in that case, the charter did apply. Um, and so anyway, back to the McKinney case. So basically in that case, the Supreme Court Justice Laforet, one of my favorites, usually good, very good decisions, he said, it is evident from what has been recounted that the university's fate is in the hands of government, and it depends on government for university funds, but it by no means follows that universities are organs of government, and this was because every university has its own governing body, it's independent. And he says, governments can't really control universities if they want to, and so this is crucial to keep in mind, and basically the charter doesn't apply. And so Bridges is saying this is a situation like that. And, she makes the point that, yes, there are freedom of speech issues here. The university is a place for speech. Like, freedom of speech on campus really, really matters. And we believe that too. I mean, don't make me tap the sign behind me, free speech matters. But the question is whether the charter applies or not. And this was looked at in a case called Lobo versus Carleton, where students at Carleton University wanted to reserve space on campus for anti-abortion protests, and the court said, and this was a motion to strike. The court didn't really even need to fully get into it. They said, this is not implementing a government policy. This is just, booking space for use on campus. Ontario is not directing in any way this particular policy. The charter is not engaged. And so, that's what Bridges is saying here too. And then the one wrinkle in this is the respondents argue that this Doug Fort's free speech policy from 2018 changes that, because they really do say, you have to respect free speech on campus, and therefore the government is in control here. To which Bridges pointed out that U of T's policy on free speech has been unchanged since 1992. The government doesn't control them in that regard. They haven't changed their behavior in any way in response to the government, and that's that. And there's a bunch of other cases she goes through, just trying to make sure there's nothing too important here. Oh, one thing I did want to point out. So basically Bridges was explaining why the charter doesn't apply, and then the justice says, okay, but there's some muddiness about whether the charter applies. Why does the university, what's the mischief here? Why do they not want it to apply? Why does the university not want it to apply? And Bridges was responding basically, it doesn't really matter if the university wants it to apply or not. The question is whether under the Constitution it does. And she just explained why, in her view, it doesn't. But she also said that universities, they really like their institutional autonomy. And that's true. Like, universities always go to court and fight to say, the charter doesn't apply to us, we make our own decisions. And that makes a lot of sense, in the sense that if you want academic freedom, you don't want the either church or the state to decide what goes on campus, right? I think that's it. There's one other really important case called Pepsi Cola, and that's a case that goes to this idea that if you're committing a tort, like nuisance or trespass, then that's impermissible regardless of where it occurs and regardless of whether it's expressive, and the charter is not going to apply if you're committing trespass, which I think is one of the really important things here. So that's sort of overview of all of U of T's argument. They made some points in response today, but that's the gist of it. And Christine, why don't you take over and talk about the occupiers, the protesters, whatever you want to call them there.
Yeah, that was great, Josh. That was
Thank
really
you.
detailed.
I
Mine is going
know.
to be less detailed and have more complaining. So today, all day, I sat on my super hot porch watching the live stream of this. I was not in the courtroom. I'm not as hardcore as you, Josh. I wanted to chill at home watching it. Um, but basically, the arguments today, how I'm going to walk through this is sort of thematically rather than chronologically. So there were two lawyers who made arguments today. Their names were Nidhi Simmons and May Nam. And I would say the first thing that Simmons wanted to do, and Nam did this
Christine,
as
I'm
well.
not sure that it was Simmons. There's some
No?
debate over that. I think she just
Okay.
looks a lot like Jackie Esmond, but one of us is
Okay.
wrong, so
Okay.
just to
Well,
warn
the
you.
the first lawyer for the encampment protesters, and actually both of them wanted to put a lot of context around the purpose of the protests. So there was a lot of emphasis on, the protesters feeling an urgent need to act due to what they perceived as an ongoing genocide in Gaza that was affecting civilians, and some of them are Palestinian. Some of them say that it was affecting their families. So there was this huge emphasis today on what I would describe as the righteousness of the protesters' cause, which really, like, frankly, is not the point. Um, and if honestly, like, that is the law does not care about the content of the speech, right? It's a content neutral right to freedom of expression. So, I mean, if your goal is to convince the judge, I mean, maybe that would work if he's especially sympathetic to this cause, but it's not supposed to work that way. Um, and in terms of righteousness, I actually think that this righteousness was all couched in things that are not obviously established in fact. So I found it really frustrating to listen to, because there were contentious assertions being made as if they are just like established fact, like repeated statements that Israel is engaged in genocide, which is, I would say, it's not accurate. It's not, does not meet the definition of genocide, but at a bare minimum, this is like a highly fraught and contentious claim. Um, Contentious assertions over the fact that they claim 40,000 people have been murdered, which, again, very contentious. That would be taking Hamas's numbers at face value and, in fact, inflating them. And it is also assuming every single one of them was a civilian, when um, more reporting suggests that it's a civilian to Hamas terrorist ratio of about 1 to 1. So, another assertion about the righteousness of the cause that is highly fraught. And of course, all of this claim of righteousness, there was zero mention, as far as I heard, about the hostages, the Israeli hostages, who are still held by Hamas in Gaza. Unless I missed it, I didn't hear it. I was listening all day. Um,
I didn't hear it either. I heard
yeah.
lots of like wild numbers about how many people have died, and at one point somebody said all these people were murdered, and
Yeah.
quoting Al Jazeera on how many deaths there are per hour, which I don't think was in the record. But anyway, yeah, you didn't hear anything about the hostages. That's right, or October 7th,
Or
really.
October 7th.
Yeah.
Nothing at all. And I think that this over the top self-righteousness, uh, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing, but I think it could be because it's very likely that the protesters are not going to win on the law here. So there's a desire perhaps to have the case about Israel itself heard in the courtroom and to make these assertions in the courtroom. Um, since there's a good chance they'll lose the injunction. And this just could be a matter of, letting your clients have their voice and their message heard in some way. So, to sort of further these self-righteous claims, or the claims of righteousness, they played many, many video clips that I don't think further the case on the law at all. For example, they played videos of protesters giving speeches outside the encampment on the steps of Convocation Hall. I mean, this wouldn't even violate U of T's policies about protesting, except maybe the loudspeaker policies. They were not in the encampment, so I don't know how it advances their case at all, other than as I said, perhaps they hope that the judge is sympathetic to the content of their speech, or perhaps they have some other desire to get their message out there. Both Simmons, or her doppelganger, and May Nam, they both, from what I could tell, read a transcript of the exact same speech given by someone. So I don't know if they didn't coordinate that with one another, or they both felt that this one particular speech from a particular protester was so powerful that they wanted to include it. But that stood out to me. So let's go on to another big theme in the encampment arguments today, which was their characterization of the protest. And one of the main things that the protesters were objecting to about yesterday was U of T's characterization or description of their encampment as violent. And they said that this characterization is rooted in anti-Palestinian racism and in Islamophobia. So the lawyers for the encampment said that the protest is actually a vibrant cultural scene where they have daily activities like kite flying. I did not see any kites the day that I was there, but I will say that I'd prefer to see a kite than a parasailer. Uh, I digress. So they also said that they have lectures and teach-ins and community meals, imam readings, indigenous ceremonies, and they mentioned many, many, many times that they have weekly Shabbat services. I
Oh, I've
don't know
noticed
how
that.
many. I don't know how many times they said they're really not anti-Semitic. I mean, that they have these weekly Shabbat services. But they really wanted to like hammer that one home. I don't know that it proves that you're not anti-Semitic, though. I don't know if they are. I don't know if they aren't. Um, but they really wanted to emphasize this. Um, but of course, they really objected to this claim that they're violent. But as you talked about, Josh, we know from yesterday the university did give these examples of violence, whether it was the altercations that you described at the gates, the anti-Semitic chalk messages, the inverted red triangles, which maybe that's just a coincidence that it's the Palestinian flag watermelon symbol that's also just used by happenstance also in Hamas propaganda murder videos, um, and totally not violent, or also not violent to project the Hamas military brigade flag on the U of T building, or chant slogans like globalize the intifada. So don't believe your racist eyes. It is a nonviolent protest, was one of the big things they wanted to emphasize, is that it was nonviolent, very peaceful, vibrant cultural scene. We all should, desire to go in there because of how lovely and wonderful and what a cultural experience it would be. Um, they also said that U of T's argument that the camp prevents free speech is Orwellian, and that the form and location of the protests are actually crucial for its message. They picked King's College Circle because it looks towards, or the administrative buildings of the university look out onto it, so they chose it for that particular reason. And that the protest encampment actually enhances rather than restricts free speech. But again, keep in mind, um, the encampment claims to let everyone in, but only after a lengthy vetting process. And they will only allow certain signs to be put up. And also, I think that it's quite dubious to believe this claim is a dubious one that they let anyone in, because we have a number of examples of people not being let in. They also made a big deal about the rules that the encampment has. Um, you mentioned this, Josh. The lawyers read from an affidavit by one of the protesters who um, discusses a script that they read to potential visitors. They say diverse opinions are allowed and that there's a protocol for visitors. They tell agitators that they're holding the gate, and if anyone's aggressive, they'll link arms and chant. But again, keep in mind if you want to go in and play football, they don't want, quote, tourists coming in. Um, and there do seem to be rules that you need to agree to about, resistance is justified and things along those lines. So the judge said that these policies, he just said that it's laudable that they have these de-escalation policies. I actually think it's good that they've done de-escalation training. That you want to de-escalate in situations like this. I agree that that would be good if they've done de-escalation training. Um, but again, if the encampment organizers get to enforce these policies, why can't the university enforce its policies in the same space? Um, one of the things that they said is that the protesters are willing to talk about opening the encampment area for people to come in before 11 a.m. But again, that kind of shows that they're the ones in control, right? They're the ones setting the policies. And this kind of feeds into another theme that was a major one from today's submissions about the lawyers for the protesters said that the protesters are willing to leave and willing to negotiate. And they talked a lot about this, about their willingness to negotiate and how the protesters actually don't want to be there indefinitely. Basically, what they want is divestment from Israel. So that would be an end to partnerships with Israeli institutions and universities and a removal of any Israeli tied assets from things like U of T pensions. Um, but again, this is their demand. They are saying we are not leaving until this demand is met. And U of T did kind of make some overtures. We know on May 23rd they presented what is called U of T called their final offer, which was a restatement of existing divestment policy that allows for ad hoc committees to consider divestment. But the protesters did not accept that because they said the U of T president has publicly opposed divestment and he has a veto. So this like willingness to leave is still like what does that even mean? It's not really a willingness to leave if you alone set the conditions and you alone decide if they are met and refuse anything else. That's still just like saying I'm staying until you do what I want. That's not like a
Can
negotiation position.
can I just quote the judge on that a little bit?
Yeah.
Because he was trying to get an answer about this. Like, how can you say that? And at one point, so I've got it in front of me, he said, "What if a group sets up an encampment that says we're not going to leave until the university stops research into vaccines or transgender issues?" Do you remember this part?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna talk about this.
Okay, so we can get into that, but like he keeps asking, he's like, "What if it's like a protest you don't agree with?" And this was Nam up for the protesters at this point, and she said, "Well, the human rights code would apply, or equality rights would apply, and so it depends on the facts before you." So she's basically saying like, if it's a protest against transgender research or research into vaccines, like if it's like a right-wing protest that well then human rights code is going to come into play or whatever, and then she just goes back to talking about how even the most offensive speech is protected. It's just a funny part, but sorry to interrupt. I just had to.
No, I think that that's a good segue into what I was going to talk about, which is the application of the charter, and this debate about whether or not U of T is public or private property, and or if it's like they said held in trust,
Right,
private property held in trust.
it's special property, they said.
Yeah,
They explain what
which
that means.
like they actually are not proposing any type of workable test for how to determine if the charter applies. It's just all context. And by context, the only thing I can assume they mean is whether or not they agree with the cause of the protest. So that kind of segues into this other thing that happened was when the judge asked them, what if the protest was about something else, something that you disagree with, like anti-vaccines or opposing trans surgeries? I mean, none of us are shocked to hear that the lawyer for the protesters thought those types of protests wouldn't be allowed because of equity and human rights. So, like, this whole notion of context is just like an unworkable test that I just think means subjective opinion about the cause of the protest. So, I could say a lot about the application of the charter, and what they argued about this. I won't spend too much time because we really covered that a lot in yours. I mean, basically what they were saying is that the charter applies, that it's public property, kind of, it's public property-ish, that charter values, which is this notoriously squishy concept, that also applies, that the charter applies, and this is protected speech. Um, that U of T enforcing against the protest would broadly restrict all protests that the university doesn't have control over, which I don't think is true. I think it would, I mean, what they're looking for is an order against, structures and barricades and overnight camping and things like that. Not, they like the university is very explicit that they're not opposed to, if you want to stand on the green, on the grass, and with a sign protesting, you can do that. Um, the lawyer for the encampment said U of T hadn't shown a strong prima facie case because U of T is not a private landowner, again, in the traditional sense, because U of T has acknowledged that King's College Circle is open to the public at large without needing permission, that it's more similar to a public park or public forum held in trust for the public, including for assembly and discussion, that this is a classic forum for expression, and that the university says freedom of expression is its institutional purpose. But as I said, I just can't get behind this. Like, they're not proposing a workable solution to how to determine in law or in statute how to characterize this property. It can't just be this context argument that they're making, because we see it that rapidly slid into whether or not the lawyer actually just agrees with the purpose of the protest. So I'll just very briefly say they also made this argument on this 2018 free speech directive. And look, the charter, I guess, would, they say that the charter would apply to that directive. That the directive implies universities must adhere to the charter standards in managing expression on campus. But I think it's an excellent point, Josh, that the university's policy on freedom of expression actually did not change following the implementation of that directive. A more interesting question, I guess, would be if another university actually did change their policies as a result of that directive, like, that would be a different fact pattern, and like, what would the outcome change there? I don't know,
Yeah,
but that's not the facts here.
I think this is actually the directive is kind of one of the most interesting things here because, we already have answers from the courts on whether the charter applies to university activities. And in general, in Ontario, it's a little bit different. Alberta courts have found differently, as people pointed out. In Ontario, it doesn't. And so if you look at free speech scholars like, Richard Moon and Jamie Cameron, like
Yeah,
very
they both quoted
respected.
them in about this. They were both quoting
Yeah,
about this issue.
they both think that, maybe this directive does mean that the charter applies. And so I think that is the protesters' best argument. I still don't see it because I still don't think the university really has control, or that, some specific program is being implemented. It's not like a hospital where the
And in this
government
case, they
is
didn't change
completely
anything. It's like
right.
still exactly the same.
Right, and it would exist anyway. So I think that's their best argument, and maybe it's time to sort of move on and just talk about like what we think might happen here. Like what? So first of all, I think we should say we do know when we'll have an answer because the judge, which was very
Yeah.
helpful, said I'm going to work on this tomorrow starting at noon, and I'm going
Still
to work.
reserved judgment. We don't do that here. We judge. But he thinks by next week.
Yeah, he didn't reserve it for very long. So yeah, next week I'm thinking because he said he'll work over the weekend. So I can't imagine finishing before Monday, but I think by next Thursday, it sounds like he's fairly committed to having a decision. And if we get that decision and the injunction's granted, then 24 or 48 hours later, there will be an order in place that Toronto police can choose to enforce or not enforce because it really is their discretion at the end of the day. But I
Yeah,
think,
that was a big part of it as well because they were having this little back and forth about the order would direct the police, and the university was like, no, it would authorize the police, not direct them. Right?
yeah,
They
exactly. The respondent should have just read the words in the order. This was a really bad part of honestly, the respondent's response is like they pointed to the proposed order U of T had, which is taken from other orders courts have granted in the past. And they're like, if you read it this way, it bans all speech on campus because it says you can't interfere with campus property. And it's like interfere doesn't mean you can't protest. It means you can't like block an
Mhm.
entrance or camp on the grass. But anyway, and the same thing with this idea, like authorizing police. Police have said they won't enforce the law here because they don't know what it is unless there's a court order. So you're not directing police by saying they're authorized to remove the encampment. So anyway, another strange sort of part of the case. So in terms of scenarios though, like I think if the injunction was not granted, it would probably be because the court is saying this reputational harm or the confrontations or the claims that Jewish people's feelings are hurt or that they're offended. This is not enough. It's not enough irreparable harm, and the campers will suffer more if they're forced to end it. I don't know how likely that is though, and I think it's more likely that the irreparable harm will be accepted. And then the really interesting stuff is we'll find out later,
Mhm.
probably whether the charter applies or not, right? Because I
I
don't know that
assume this will go all the way on the merits.
I would assume so too, but I guess it's up to U of T, right? They might get their interim injunction, or not interim, interlocutory. This is like a different type of injunction. They might get it, the protesters leave, they give up, the war ends, and U of T is like, we don't want to know the answer to this because we might not like
Yeah.
the answer about whether the
Because
charter
the law right
applies.
now, basically, it in Ontario really is that the charter doesn't apply. And they probably don't want to mess with that.
Yeah, that's what I think is quite possible. So it might not go all the way, but it might also be that the judge just says, "Yeah, look, this is a trespass case. They're trespassing. We don't even get to the charter, right?
Mhm.
This is a trespass tort. It's not about freedom of speech, and you have to leave." I think that's also possible, and I don't know, of all the arguments, like who knows, but that one's really appealing to me. That seems to make the most sense based on what I've seen. But who knows? He could say the charter does apply, but this is like baddie and these are reasonable limits. They're just saying, you can't be there after 10. I don't know. So many possible scenarios, and it's dumb to try and bet
I
what judge
still
is gonna
think,
do.
yeah, I still think strategically, and have said this on the show before, that once convocation is done, and I think it's either done this week or last week, that they would just go home, that they don't want to, like, they're not bothering anyone anymore. And it might have been a strategic mistake to even try to bring the injunction if it wasn't going to be resolved before the convocation, because now it's given them like a reason to stay, right? Now they have a reason to stay to fight this. If they just like been ignored and convocation ended, I think a lot of these people would have just like given up and gone home. But
Yeah,
I
and
don't know. Like, I guess UFT can't, like, would have to take a risk that that would happen. But that's the impression that I had when I was there on Friday, and it seemed like a ghost town.
yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Who knows what the strategy was because the U of T wanted this to be heard like a week after they asked for it,
Yeah, I imagine.
so the convocation could go ahead without the encampment in the background and all of the further reputational damage that they say they're worried about. But then this justice said, no, let's do this a few weeks in the future. And I actually, at first, I was thinking this is not good. This should be heard right away. But now the fact that they've had a few weeks, they have a pretty good record. Like the
Yeah, it's a
judge
big
really
record.
does, he really does know all the ins and outs of what's going on there. I don't think if you like delayed this any longer, you would you get all that much better evidence. And so I think he has more justification now to give us more guidance about whether the charter applies, the trespass issue. Like, I think he can make a bigger, more solid, not more solid decision, but I think he can it'll be more satisfying resolution since they did wait. But yeah, I guess we'll see. We'll see what
Yeah,
happens.
I'm excited. Well, we'll
Me
have
too.
an update in our episode when the decision comes out to talk about what the decision says.
Sounds good. So I guess we'll leave it at that. And as always, we say subscribe. If you're on YouTube, subscribe on YouTube. Subscribe on Spotify. Subscribe on Apple. Tell all your
And rate
friends.
us, review us, share us.
Yeah, do all that good stuff because it definitely helps us grow the show. So, all right, that's the end of the show. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks.
All right, that was fun.
We're still recording.
Yeah, that's okay. We're not live,
Okay.
so it
Okay.
doesn't matter. I'll just
I
cut
think
it
that was
off.
good.